countries and their fellow member states. I now recognize my partner, Ranking Member, Mr. McCaul, for his opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, for joining us here today. And just let me first say I really appreciated the outreach to me and our phone conversation that we had. And I do think we have far more in common than we don't. And we also talked a lot about the CCP and its sort of concerted effort to take over key positions within the United Nations. And I think we need to be a leader and have the United States and our allies in those positions of power at the UN. And we are certainly in agreement on that. And thanks for being here today. You certainly have a lot of challenges, no question. As the chairman talked about, I want to start out as we speak, millions of lives are at risk in Tigray. And while maybe a lot of people back home in our districts don't know a lot about this, as the fighting continues, there's starvation and systematic rape are being used as a weapon of war. And comments from Administrator Power that Ethiopia is, quote, destroying the reproductive health of Tigrayans really calls into question whether conditions amount to a genocide under the 1948 Genocide Convention. And I don't think it's going to get better. I think it's going to get worse. At the same time, with the U.S. withdrawing from Afghanistan, we will likely face a refugee crisis in the region in the coming months. The UN will undoubtedly have a critical role to play in addressing this impending humanitarian emergency. And last year, Russia abused its Security Council vote, as the chairman talked about, to force the closure of some border crossings into Syria as well. This limited delivery of life-saving assistance to innocent Syrians is in desperate need. As you know, there's a bipartisan, bicameral support for maintaining and expanding cross-border access. Security Council will soon vote to renew access to the border crossing that allows vital humanitarian aid to flow to millions of Syrians. I hope you will update us today on your strategy to protect these crossings from Russia's malicious veto. And the lack of a robust international response to these tragedies and the missteps in the early stages of COVID-19 pandemic remind us that international organizations are important, but also need reform. And that starts, in my judgment, with the World Health Organization. Director General Tedros praised the CCP for its, quote, transparency and for setting a, quote, new standard for outbreak response. This is despite widespread evidence that the CCP was suppressing the sequence of the virus that causes COVID-19. They arrested doctors and journalists. They censored social media discussions of the outbreak within China. The WHO's embrace of the CCP's propaganda directly impacted how Americans and the entire world viewed the virus. In fact, they failed in their most paramount mission to warn the world of a global pandemic. One American expert who provides technical assistance to the WHO said, quote, "We were deceived." And on top of that, earlier this month, with the tacit approval of the Biden administration, Belarus and Syria were elected to serve on the WHO's executive board. Understandably, there have been voices, including mine, advocating for significant reforms at the WHO, including the removal of Tedros as Director General. It's no wonder the American people are losing faith in international organizations. And that's why I think, as we talked about, U.S. leadership in these organizations is really more critical now than ever, and why the United States should be honest and clear-eyed about where we choose to engage. Earlier this year, I was troubled when President Biden announced the United States would rejoin the UN Human Rights Council. I agree, we have to be engaged. We can't leave the playing field. But as you know, the UN Human Rights Council has a history of protecting some of the world's worst human rights abusers. Current members of the council include the PRC, who are actively committing genocide in Xinjiang, and yet they're on the UN Human Rights Council. Russia has carried out nerve agent attacks on political opposition leaders like Navalny. and Venezuela, where Maduro-backed forces have killed more than 20,000 people. I did appreciate Secretary Blinken when he raised some of these issues publicly at the council. But we should make reforms to the council as a prerequisite to returning. And I do think it's important to remember the U.S. engagement with international organizations like the United Nations brings significant financial contributions from American taxpayers. In fact, the U.S. accounts for roughly 1/4 of both the regular and peacekeeping budgets at the UN. And we are the largest donor to the WHO, contributing roughly 15% of their annual budget in 2019. So I think the American people deserve to know that their money is being used wisely to help the global community and to influence the UN to reflect the American values of freedom and democracy. And of course, it's been reported, Madam Ambassador, that taxpayer money went to the lab in Wuhan, and there's so many questions regarding that. I understand that the quest for scientific research, but we also need to know what happened at that lab to ensure that it never happens again. So with that, I want to thank you again for joining us. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCaul. I would like now to turn to the chair and ranking member of the International Development International Organization